She stacked river slate against her walls. Halvor Breke, who had hauled freight across the Dakota prairie for 11 years, told her, "When the fire drops, your girls will die before that wall learns pity." She had $14, two daughters, and no way to haul the wood she needed. On January the 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Marit Assen had never stacked a stone against a wall. She had arrived in Split Rock Creek country in late August of 1887 with a borrowed wagon, two daughters, and the ashes of a husband buried 3 months in Minnesota soil. The threshing accident had taken Gunnar in 4 days. The farm went to creditors in 6 weeks. What remained fit in one wagon bed, a trunk, bedding, the children, and $14 folded into a sock she kept against her ribs. The claim shanty stood 10 feet by 12, with 7-foot posts and daylight visible between the boards. Her brother-in-law Lars had filed on an adjacent quarter section in June and promised to help her prove up. He had described the shanty as sound. He had described Dakota as opportunity. He had described himself as reliable. Lars sold his team interest 3 weeks after Marit arrived. He left for Sioux Falls with a railroad agent who promised work, and he took the only wagon strong enough to haul timber or cordwood any real distance. He did not say goodbye to his nieces. Marit stood in the doorway of the shanty and watched the dust settle on the section road. 8-year-old Eli asked when Uncle Lars was coming back. 5-year-old Christy asked if they could eat soon. The stove was a small cast-iron box she had bought second-hand on credit from the merchant at the rail depot. The note on it was $12. She had 1¼ cords of mixed cottonwood and twisted scrub stacked against the south wall, cut and hauled by Lars before he decided to leave. She had a south-facing window with a single pane that let in light and let out heat. She had walls that whistled when the wind found the right angle. She had no way to get more wood, no team, no wagon capable of real loads, no money to hire either. The nearest timber worth cutting stood 7 miles north along the creek breaks, and even if she could reach it, she could not fell, buck, split, and haul what this winter would demand. Not alone, not with 2 children, not with hands that knew needle and thread better than axe and maul. Marit did the arithmetic in her head that first week, and the numbers refused to change no matter how many times she counted. The knock came on the 4th morning after Lars left. Halvor Breke filled the doorway like weather moving in. He was 62 years old, with a face that looked carved from the same oak he had once hauled across 200 miles of prairie as a freight driver. His hands were slabs of scarred leather. His eyes moved across the shanty's interior the way a man reads a bill of sale he already knows he will regret. "Gunnar's widow," he said. It was not a question. "Marit Assen. I know who you are. Knew your husband's cousin in Brookings." He stepped inside without asking permission. The boards creaked under his weight. "Lars is gone?" 3 weeks now. Halvor grunted. He crossed to the stove corner and pressed his palm flat against the boards where the pipe passed through. Then he walked the perimeter, knocking his knuckles against each wall in turn. He crouched and examined the gaps where the bottom boards met the packed earth floor. Eli and Christy watched from the bed corner, silent. "How much wood?" Halvor asked. 1¼ cords, maybe closer to 1. He looked at the pile visible through the window. "I count 1, generous, mixed cottonwood, some of it punky, some green." He turned back to her. "You have children." "I have daughters." "I can see what they are." He walked to the stove and opened the fire door. Cold ash. The morning was mild enough that she had not lit it. "You understand what is coming?" It was not a question either, but Marit answered. "Winter." "Not winter." Halvor closed the fire door with a sound like a judgment. "Winter is what they have in Minnesota. What comes here—" He gestured at the walls, the gaps, the single cord of questionable wood. "On this ground, With these walls, with that much fuel, winter is what kills you. He walked past her to the doorway and stood looking out at the open prairie. The grass was still green gold in the late summer light. The sky was the kind of blue that made people believe in gentle futures. I have hauled freight across this territory for 11 years, he said. Before that, I built 3 winter shelters on open claims between here and the James River. I have seen what the cold does to people who prepare, and I have seen what it does to people who do not. He turned to face her. You are not prepared. I know. Do you? His voice carried no cruelty, only the flat weight of accumulated fact. You need 4 cords minimum to keep a stove alive through a Dakota winter. 5 is safer, 6 if the walls leak like these do. You have one and half of it will burn fast and give you nothing but smoke and frustration. I cannot get more. I know that too. He looked at the children, then back at Marit. Lars spoke of you before he left, said you were stubborn, said you would not listen to reason. Lars said many things. He said you refused to sell the claim and go back east. I have no money for passage. I have no family to return to. If I abandon the claim, I still owe $12 on the stove, and I have nothing to show for the last 3 months of my life, except 2 children and a husband in the ground. Halvor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There is a man at the depot who buys distressed claims, Emmett Kroll. He would give you enough to clear the stove note and maybe buy passage to Sioux Falls. You could find work there, domestic service, laundry, something. And my daughters? They would come with you, I imagine. To what? A boarding house room while I wash other people's sheets? A charity home if I cannot find work fast enough? Marit felt the heat rising in her chest, the anger that had been building since the day the threshing machine caught Gunnar's sleeve and pulled him into the works. I did not cross an ocean and bury a husband to become a washerwoman in a city that smells like cattle. Then you will die here. Halvor said it simply, without malice. Or your children will. Same result, different sequence. He stepped out of the shanty into the morning light. Marit followed him to the doorway. I have seen it happen, he said, not looking at her. 1879, a widow on a quarter section 12 miles northwest of here. 2 children, just like you. Thought she could make it on half the wood she needed. Thought the walls would hold better than they did. He paused. Found them in February. The children first, then her. She had burned the furniture by then. Burned part of the floor. Still was not enough. Marit's hands were shaking. She gripped the doorframe to still them. I am not telling you this to be cruel, Halvor said. I am telling you because you have maybe 8 weeks before the first hard cold, and right now you are on the same path she was. He turned to face her one last time. Sell the claim. Take what Kroll offers. It is not the life you wanted, but it is a life. He walked to his horse, a broad-chested gray that looked as weathered as its rider. He mounted with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life in saddles than chairs. And if I do not sell? Marit called after him. Halvor gathered the reins. Then I will see you in the spring, Marit Assen, or I will see what is left of you. He rode east toward the section road without looking back. Marit did not sell. She told herself it was principle. She told herself it was stubbornness. She told herself that Halvor Brekka, for all his years and all his experience, did not know her, did not know what she was capable of, did not know that she had crossed an ocean at 19 and buried her mother at 22 and learned to make do with nothing because nothing was often all there was. But at night, when the children slept and the shanty creaked in the wind, she admitted a simpler truth. She did not sell because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to try. So she began the work that was available to her. She walked the creek breaks looking for deadfall. She dragged branches back to the shanty 1 armload at a time. She twisted prairie hay into fuel sticks the way the neighbor women had shown her. though they burned fast and gave weak heat. She scraped together every scrap of combustible material within walking distance and stacked it against the south wall beside Lars's inadequate cord. After 2 weeks, she had added perhaps a quarter cord of scrub and deadfall, plus enough hay twist to fill a corner of the shanty. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. The arithmetic remained merciless. She needed 5 cords. She had less than 2. She could not get more. Marit stood at the creek one afternoon in early September, knee-deep in cold water, pulling a waterlogged branch toward the bank. The girls were back at the shanty with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone except her. The sun was warm on her shoulders, warm enough that the coming winter felt like a lie someone had invented to frighten her. She hauled the branch onto the bank and sat on a flat gray stone to catch her breath. The stone was cool against her legs through the wet fabric of her skirt. She noticed that the creek bed here was littered with similar stones, flat, dark, layered things that split apart in thin sheets where the water had worked at them. She thought nothing of it. She picked up the branch and began the long walk back. The realization came 3 nights later, and it came not from the creek, but from the stove. Marit had a flat stone she used as a kettle rest beside the fire door. She had found it the first week, had liked its size and shape, and had placed it where she could set the coffee pot without scorching the boards. She thought of it as furniture, not science. That night, she had let the fire burn down to coals while she mended a tear in Eli's dress. The shanty cooled. The stovepipe went from warm to cold. The iron of the fire door lost its heat within an hour. But when Marit reached for the kettle stone to move it aside, she pulled her hand back in surprise. The stone was still warm. She pressed her palm against it. Not hot. The fire had been down for over an hour, but warm. Warmer than the air. Warmer than the iron. Warmer than anything else in the shanty except the children under their blankets. Marit sat very still. She thought about her mother's house in Norway, the stone bake oven that held heat for hours after the fire died. The flat, dark stones her mother would set beside the oven on washing days, so the room would stay warm while the clothes dried. She remembered pressing her palm to those stones as a child and finding them warm at dusk when they had been heated at noon. She had filed that memory away as a fact about her mother's house, not as a principle that could be applied elsewhere. Now she looked at the kettle stone and the cooling shanty and the single cord of inadequate wood stacked outside, and something shifted in her understanding. The problem was not only fuel, the problem was what happened after the fuel burned. A fire could heat a room, but the heat left as soon as the flames dropped. The air cooled, the boards cooled. Everything radiated warmth outward into the Dakota night, and within an hour of banking the stove, the shanty was nearly as cold as the world outside. But stone did not behave like air. Stone held what you gave it. Marit looked around the shanty. Bare boards, empty corners, nothing to catch the heat and keep it. The stove worked all day to warm the air, and every night the air escaped through cracks and gaps in that single thin-paned window, and by morning she woke to visible breath and frost on the inside of the boards. What if the stove was not warming air? What if it was warming stone? The next morning, Marit walked back to the creek. She did not look for deadfall this time. She looked at the flat, dark stones scattered along the banks and exposed in the cuts where the water had carved through the earth. She picked one up. It was heavier than she expected, dense and cool in her hands. She set it down and picked up another. This one was thinner, the size of a serving platter, split cleanly along its grain. She carried 3 stones back to the shanty. She washed them and set them beside the stove to dry. That evening she heated them through, not directly on the fire, but near enough to absorb the warmth radiating from the iron sides. After supper she moved the warm stones to the bed corner where the children slept. She checked them by touch through the evening. At bedtime they were still warm, At midnight, when she rose to feed the stove, they were cool, but not cold. The corner where they sat was measurably less frigid than the rest of the room. 3 stones. A difference. Marit lay awake that night while the stove ticked and the wind probed the walls. She thought about the creek bed full of flat stone. She thought about the walls of the shanty, empty and leaking. She thought about Halvor Brekka's verdict. 5 cords minimum, and she did not have 2. What if she did not need 5 cords? What if she could make less fuel last longer? The idea was absurd. She was not a builder. She had never stacked stone or laid a wall or done anything more architectural than hang a curtain. The notion of lining her shanty with rock seemed like the kind of plan a desperate woman invented to avoid facing the truth of her situation. But the truth of her situation was that she would die without a new plan. Her children would die. The arithmetic did not lie, and the arithmetic said that more fuel was not coming. If she could not get more heat into the room, perhaps she could keep more heat in the room. Stone held what you gave it. The creek was full of stone. The winter was 8 weeks away. Marit got up before dawn and began making calculations. She explained the idea to Bere Moen 3 days later, and Bere's face moved through confusion to concern to something close to alarm. You want to fill your house with rocks. Not fill, line. Marit drew a shape in the dirt with a stick. The walls, here and here, the coldest sides, and around the stove. Stone holds heat longer than air. If I warm the stone during the day, you are bringing winter into the room. Bere's voice was flat. You are shrinking your house before cold even arrives. The house is too big anyway, too much air to warm. So you make it smaller with cold stone? With stone that will be warm. After the first day, after the fire has... Marit. Bere was a practical woman, 34 years old, mother of 3, survivor of 2 Dakota winters already. She did not speak with Halvor's authority or Emmett Kroll's contempt. She spoke with the weariness of someone who had seen too many neighbors fail. You do not have enough wood to keep the stove alive through February. How does adding stone help? Stone does not burn. Stone holds. Stone is cold. Stone in January is cold that seeps into your bones and never leaves. Bere stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. I have seen root cellars lined with stone. I have seen them in July, and they are cold enough to keep milk. You want to build a root cellar inside your house? You want to sleep in an ice box? Not if the stone is warmed first. And if you cannot warm it fast enough, if the fire burns down before the rock takes the heat? Bere shook her head. You will have wasted weeks hauling rock. You will have a house full of frozen stone and not enough wood to heat it, and your children will be colder than if you had left the walls alone. Marit did not have an answer to that. Bere was not wrong. The risk was obvious. Cold stone could steal heat before it gave any back. If the method failed, she would have wasted the last weeks before winter filling her shelter with material that worked against her. I know the danger, Marit said. Do you? Because Halvor says you are intelligent but stubborn. He says you refuse to sell. Halvor thinks I should wash sheets in Sioux Falls. Halvor thinks you should live. Bere met her eyes. There are worse things than washing sheets, Marit. There are worse things than swallowing your pride and finding work you did not want. I know. I have swallowed enough pride to choke on it. She paused. But I am alive. My children are alive. We will see spring. I will see spring too. With a house full of river rock? With whatever I can manage. Marit stood. I'm not asking for your approval, Bere. I'm telling you what I am doing so someone knows. If I'm wrong, if it fails... She hesitated. Look after my girls, please, as long as you can. Bere was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You are actually going to do this. I have no other plan. You could sell." "No." Marit picked up the stick and broke it in half. "I could not." Beret sighed. "Then I will come check on you, weekly at least, until the snow makes it impossible." She turned to leave, then stopped. "What kind of stone?" "The flat, dark kind from the creek. It splits thin. I can carry it." "Slate, probably, or something like it. The creek cuts through old rock down there." Beret shook her head again, but there was something different in her expression now. Not approval, but perhaps a reluctant recognition. "My husband would say you are mad. He would say stone belongs under houses, not inside them. Your husband is not here." "No, he's in Brookings buying seed for spring planting." Beret almost smiled. "He would say I should talk you out of this." "Can you?" "No." Beret walked toward her wagon. "I do not think anyone can." Emmett Kroll came to the shanty on a Thursday afternoon in late September. He arrived in a light wagon with good springs, pulled by a matched pair of bays that probably cost more than Marit's entire claim. He wore a coat that had never seen real work and boots that had never stepped in anything worse than mud. His smile arrived before he did, broad and warm and utterly false. "Mrs. Asen." He stepped down from the wagon with the ease of a man who owned the ground he walked on. "I've been meaning to call on you. Terrible about Lars, just terrible." Marit was hauling a sled load of stone from the creek. She had improvised the sled from scrap lumber and rope, and it scraped across the grass with a sound like complaint. The stone on it weighed perhaps 80 pounds, 4 slabs of the flat, dark rock, the most she could drag at one time. "Mr. Kroll." "Emmett, please." He glanced at the sled, at the stone piled beside the shanty, at the raw scrape marks in the dirt where she had been dragging loads all week. His smile did not change. "That's quite a project you have there." "Yes?" "Building something? Root cellar, maybe?" He walked toward the pile as if he owned it. "Strange time of year to dig a cellar. Ground will freeze soon." "I am not building a cellar." "No?" He picked up one of the slabs and weighed it in his hands. "Nice stone. Splits clean. What do you use it for?" Marit set down the sled rope. "Why are you here, Mr. Kroll?" "Emmett." The smile flickered, just slightly. "I'm here as a neighbor, as a concerned member of the community." He set the stone down and brushed his hands together. "Word is that Lars left you in a difficult position. Word is that you're short on supplies, short on help, and looking at a hard winter. Word travels fast. Small community. People talk." He spread his hands in a gesture of sympathy. "I wanted you to know that there are options. I know Halvor Brekke came to see you. Probably painted a grim picture. Probably made it sound hopeless." He lowered his voice as if sharing a secret. "But it doesn't have to be hopeless, Marit. There are people who can help. People like you. People like me." He smiled again. "I have a small side business. Nothing fancy. I help folks who find themselves in difficult circumstances. Folks with claims they can't prove up, debts they can't pay, winters they can't survive." He paused for effect. "I buy claims, fair price, cash in hand, enough to clear any debts and get a fresh start somewhere else." "You buy distressed land." "I prefer to think of it as providing a service." The smile hardened slightly. "That claim you're sitting on is worth maybe $300 to a buyer who plans to work it. But you can't work it, can you? No team, no help, no real supplies. In 6 months, if you're still here, you'll owe taxes and improvements you can't afford. In a year, you'll lose it anyway. I'm offering you a way out before that happens." "How much?" $30. He said it like a gift. Clear the stove note, buy you passage to Sioux Falls, leave you a little extra for getting settled. It's more than fair given the circumstances. The claim is worth 300. To someone who can work it, to you, right now, it's worth whatever keeps you and your children alive through March. Kroll glanced at the stone pile again. Whatever this project is, Marit, it's not going to save you. Rocks don't keep people warm. Perhaps not. Definitely not. I've seen a lot of winters here. I've seen what works and what doesn't. What works is fuel. Lots of fuel. More than you have, more than you can get. He stepped closer, lowering his voice again. Take the $30. I'll have papers drawn up by Monday. You can be in Sioux Falls by the end of the month, looking for work while the weather's still good for travel. Marit looked at him for a long moment. He was not wrong about the situation. He was not even wrong about the odds. But she had seen the way his eyes moved across her land, calculating. She had heard the way he said $30 like it was charity instead of theft. Mr. Kroll. Emmett. Mr. Kroll. She picked up the sled rope. I am not selling. His smile finally died. You're making a mistake. Perhaps. Not perhaps. Definitely. I've seen your kind before, Marit. Proud women who think stubbornness is the same as strength. They come out here with nothing, and they refuse to admit when they've lost. He stepped back toward his wagon. I'll ask again in November. The price will be lower then, but the offer will still stand, assuming you're still here to receive it. I will be here? We'll see. He climbed into the wagon and gathered the reins. I hope you know what you're doing with those rocks. I truly do. Because when they find you frozen in the spring, I'd hate to think you died surrounded by a pile of stone you couldn't burn. He turned the team and drove back toward the section road without another word. Marit watched him go. Then she picked up the sled rope and resumed dragging. By the first week of October, Marit had hauled perhaps a ton of flat stone from the creek to the shanty. It sat in a pile beside the south wall like an accusation, evidence of either determination or madness, depending on who was looking. The stone was work. It was the hardest physical labor Marit had ever done in her life. She rose before dawn each day, fed the girls breakfast, and walked to the creek. The flat slabs were scattered along the banks and exposed in the cuts where water had carved through layers of old rock. She learned to spot the good ones, dark gray, dense, splitting cleanly along the grain into sheets she could carry. The best pieces were the size of serving platters and weighed 10 to 15 pounds each. The worst were too thick, too irregular, or too crumbly to be worth the effort. She could carry 4 good pieces per trip if she used the sled. 8 trips per day meant 32 pieces, perhaps 300 pounds of stone. Her shoulders ached. Her back seized in the mornings. Her hands developed blisters that broke and bled and hardened into calluses that split and bled again. But the pile grew. The stacking was the second problem. She could not simply heap the stone against the walls and hope it would stay. The slabs had to be layered, fitted, supported somehow so they would not shift and collapse. Marit had never built anything from stone. She did not know how masons worked, did not know the principles of weight and balance that held walls together. She stacked and restacked. The first attempt fell over in the night. The second held for 2 days before sagging outward under its own weight. The third was still standing when she went to bed, but she woke to find a gap where the middle courses had shifted and several slabs had cracked. By the 3rd week of October, she had lined perhaps a quarter of the north wall, the coldest side of the shanty, the side that caught the worst of the winter wind. The stone rose to her waist in places, lower in others where she had been forced to rebuild. It was rough, uneven, ugly work. But when she held her hand near it after a day of burning stove, she could feel the warmth, The stone was taking the heat. She could not say yet whether it would give it back in the way that mattered, in the dead hours before dawn when the fire burned down and the air went cold, but it was taking the heat. That was something. That was a beginning. The weather turned in the last week of October. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and Marit woke to frost on the inside of the boards and her breath visible in the air above the blankets. She lit the stove and fed it hard through the morning. The shanty warmed slowly. The stone wall on the north side was cold to the touch at dawn, warmer by noon, and warm, genuinely warm, by evening. That night she banked the fire low and waited. At midnight the stove had cooled. The air in the shanty was cold. The boards were cold. The pane of the window was rimed with ice. But when Marit pressed her palm to the stone wall, it was still warm, not hot, not warm enough to be comfortable if she stood against it, but warm, warmer than the air, warmer than anything else in the room except the stove itself, which still held some residual heat in its iron mass. She checked again at 2 a.m, still warm, though cooler now. She checked at 4, barely warm, but not cold. Not the dead cold of the bare boards on the east wall, which had turned to ice. By dawn, the stone was room temperature. It had given back what the stove had given it, slowly through the night. Marit sat on the edge of the bed and watched the first gray light come through the frosted window. The children were still asleep under the blankets, their breathing slow and even. They had not woken in the night. They had not complained of cold. It had worked. It had worked, but barely. A quarter of one wall. A few hours of warmth before the stone cooled to match the dying room. She needed more stone, more wall, more mass to absorb the stove's heat and hold it through the long nights. And she had perhaps 6 weeks before the real cold came. Marit dressed in the gray light and walked out to the stone pile. The frost crunched under her boots. The pile was smaller than she wanted, larger than she had expected. Somewhere between hope and despair, there was work to be done. She picked up the sled rope and began the walk to the creek. The children would wake soon, and they would be hungry, and the stove would need feeding, and there were 100 small tasks that would fight for her attention through the day. But for now, in the first light, there was only the work and the cold and the arithmetic that said she needed more stone before the snow came. She did not know if she would finish in time. She did not know if the method would work at the scale she needed, or if Beret was right and the cold stone would steal more heat than it saved. She did not know if Halvor's prediction would come true, or if Emmett Kroll would be counting her failure by spring. She knew only that she was not done, that there was more to build, more to haul, more to stack, that every slab she dragged from the creek was a small act of defiance against the numbers that said she could not survive. The wind picked up from the northwest, carrying the first bite of what was coming. Marit leaned into it and kept walking. The woman appeared at the creek on a morning in early November, when the temperature had dropped enough to skin ice along the slow edges of the water. Marit was crouched at the bank, sorting through a scatter of flat stone exposed by the falling water level. She had learned to recognize the best pieces by now, the dense, dark slabs that rang when struck, the ones that split cleanly and lay flat without rocking. She had also learned that the creek was not infinite. The easy stone near the banks was mostly gone. Now she had to wade into the shallows or climb down into the cuts to find what she needed. She did not hear the woman approach. One moment she was alone with the cold water and the scattered rock. The next, a voice spoke from the bank behind her. "You are sorting wrong." Marit straightened and turned. The woman standing above her was perhaps 50, perhaps older. It was hard to tell with faces that had been weathered by work and wind. She was thin, sharp-featured, with gray hair pulled back under a dark wool cap. Her hands were red and cracked, the hands of someone who had spent years in cold water. I am sorry? The stone. The woman pointed at the pieces Marit had set aside. You are choosing by color. You should choose by weight. Marit looked at her sorted pile. She had been selecting the darkest slabs, the ones that looked most like the kettle stone that had started all of this. The dark ones hold heat better. The dense ones hold heat better. Color tells you nothing. The woman climbed down the bank with surprising ease for her age. She picked up one of Merritt's rejected pieces, a lighter gray slab with visible grain, and hefted it. This one is denser than the dark one beside it. Feel. Merritt took the stone. It was heavier than it looked, heavier than a darker piece of similar size. Slate is not all the same, the woman said. Some split soft, some splits hard. The hard kind takes heat and holds it. The soft kind crumbles and cracks. She took back the stone and rapped it against another. The sound was sharp, almost metallic. Listen for the ring. Dead sound means soft stone. Ring means hard. How do you know this? The woman set the stone down and looked at Marit with eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. I am Torbjörn Vik. I knew your husband's mother in the old country, though we never spoke much. I heard there was a Norwegian widow hauling stone from the creek, and I came to see if the stories were true. What stories? That you are building a stone wall inside your house. Torbjörn almost smiled. That you are either very clever or very mad. That Emmett Kroll is telling everyone you will be dead by spring, and that Halvor Brekke says the same thing but feels worse about it. Marit felt the familiar heat of anger in her chest. Everyone has opinions about what I'm doing. Everyone always has opinions. Most of them are worthless. Torbjörn crouched beside the sorted stones and began rearranging them with quick, practiced movements. I do not have opinions. I have observations. And I observe that you are sorting wrong, stacking wrong, and probably firing wrong too. Firing. The stove. How you burn it. How you charge the stone. She looked up at Marit. Have you been building hot fires or steady fires? Hot. You thought more heat meant more storage. It does not work that way. Hot fires spike the surface of the stone and leave the core cold. Steady fires warm the mass all the way through. Torbjörn stood and brushed her hands on her skirt. Show me what you have built. It was not a request. Marit found herself leading the older woman back to the shanty without quite deciding to do so. Torbjörn walked the interior of the shanty the way Halvor had walked it 2 months earlier, but where Halvor had looked for weakness, Torbjörn looked for structure. She touched the stone wall on the north side, pressed her palm flat against it, knocked on it with her knuckles. How thick? 3 inches in most places, 4 where I had enough stone. Too thin in spots, thick enough in others. Torbjörn crouched and examined the base of the wall where it met the floor. What are you using for packing? Packing? Between the stones, in the gaps. She pointed at a space between 2 slabs. Air lives here. Air does not hold heat. You need something to fill the voids. I did not know. Clay, mixed with ash from the stove. Torbjörn straightened. Not everywhere, just the deepest gaps. Enough to make the wall act like one piece instead of 100 pieces stacked on each other. She moved to the stove corner where Marit had begun lining the walls closest to the heat source. This is better. This is where the stone matters most. That is where I started. Good. The stove side first, then the coldest wall, then the other walls if you have time, but you will not have time. Torbjörn turned to face her. How much stone have you hauled? perhaps 1.5 tons, maybe closer to 2. You need 3, minimum, more if you want the sleeping corner protected. She glanced at the children who were watching from the bed with wide eyes. You have daughters, Eli and Christy. I see. Torbjörn's expression did not change, but something shifted in her voice. I had a daughter once. She did not survive her first winter here. She turned back to the wall. That was 11 years ago. I learned a great deal about heat and cold that winter. I learned what kills children and what keeps them alive. Marit did not know what to say. She stood in silence while Torbjörn continued her inspection. The principle is sound, Torbjörn said finally. Stone takes heat and gives it back. I've seen it work in bake ovens, in the stone works at Sioux Falls, where I washed clothes for the laborers, in the old houses back home. But the principle is not enough. The method matters. She fixed Marit with a steady gaze. You have maybe 5 weeks before the worst cold comes. I can show you how to do this right, but you will have to work harder than you have ever worked, and you will have to listen to me even when you think you know better. Why would you help me? Because you remind me of myself before I learned better. Torbjörn almost smiled again. And because Emmett Kroll told me you would be dead by February, and I would like very much to prove that man wrong. Torbjörn returned the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the next 3 weeks. She did not do the hauling. Her back would not allow it, she said, though Marit suspected it was more a matter of principle than infirmity. But she did everything else. She taught Marit to sort stone by weight and ring, discarding the soft pieces that would crack under repeated heating and cooling. She showed her how to fit the slabs tight against each other, choosing pieces that nested like plates in a stack. She demonstrated the clay and ash mixture that filled the gaps without adding bulk, a paste that dried hard and held the stones in place. Not too wet, she said, working the mixture with her hands. Wet clay shrinks when it dries, cracks, falls out. You want it just damp enough to spread, no more. She taught Marit to build in courses, each layer offset from the one below so the joints did not line up. She showed her how to angle the lower courses slightly inward so the weight pressed the wall together instead of pushing it apart. The stone wants to fall, Torbjörn said. Your job is to make it fall into itself, not away from the wall. Most importantly, she taught Marit about fire. You have been burning wrong, she said on the 3rd day, watching Marit load the stove with a split log. Big wood, hot fire, fast burn. That is how you heat air. That is not how you heat stone. Then how? Small wood, steady fire, long burn. Torbjörn adjusted the damper on the stovepipe, restricting the airflow. You want coals, not flame. Coals give even heat. Flame gives spikes and crashes. She pointed at the stone wall. The wall does not care about spikes. The wall cares about hours. Give it 4 hours of steady warmth, and it will give you 4 hours back. Give it 1 hour of violent heat, and it will give you cracked stone and a cold night. Marit thought about all the fires she had built in the past 2 months, blazing hot when she had wood, dead cold when she ran low. I did not know. You know now. Torbjörn handed her a smaller piece of split wood. Feed the fire like you are feeding a child. Small bites, often. Not a feast followed by starvation. The progress markers told the story of the next weeks. By mid-November, the north wall was fully lined to shoulder height, with the lower courses packed and dried. The stove corner was dense with stone, wrapping around the heat source like an embrace. By late November, the west wall was half covered. Marit's shoulders had stopped screaming and settled into a permanent ache that she barely noticed anymore. Her hands were hard as cured leather. By the first week of December, a section of the west wall collapsed. She heard it in the middle of the night, a sliding, grinding sound followed by a crash that woke the children crying and brought her bolt upright in the bed with her heart hammering. In the light of the banked stove, she saw the damage. The middle courses had shifted outward, pulling the upper stones down in a cascade that left a gap in the wall and a scatter of broken slabs on the floor. She stood in the cold room and looked at 3 weeks of work undone in a moment. Mama? Eli's voice was thin with fear. What happened? The wall fell. Marit heard her own voice as if from a distance, flat and strange. Part of it. Can you fix it? Marit did not answer. She walked to the collapsed section and crouched beside it, running her hands over the broken pieces. The slabs had cracked along the grain, split by the stress of their own shifting weight. Half of them were useless now, too fragmented to restack. She had 3 weeks until the deepest cold. She had just lost a quarter of her west wall, and she did not have enough stone stockpiled to rebuild from scratch. Torbjörg came at dawn and surveyed the damage with the same flat expression she wore for everything. The lower courses were not angled enough, she said. The weight pushed out instead of down. I know. You will need to rebuild from the floor, and you will need different stone for the base, thicker pieces that can bear the load. I know. Torbjörg looked at her. You also know that you do not have time to haul more stone, sort it, fit it, and rebuild before the cold comes. Marit said nothing. There is another way. Torbjörg walked to the stove and opened the fire door. We do not rebuild the whole wall. We build a brace instead. Timber cleats against the boards, angled to hold the stone from falling outward. It is ugly. It takes space. But it is fast. I do not have timber. I know someone who does. Torbjörg closed the fire door. Halvor Brekka owes me a debt from 3 winters ago. I think it is time to collect. Halvor came that afternoon with a wagon load of scrap timber, odds and ends from a barn raising, he said. Pieces too short or too crooked for proper use. He would not take payment, though his jaw was tight when he refused it. I did not think you would still be here, he said to Marit while Torbjörg directed the unloading. I am still here. I see that. He looked at the stone walls, at the collapsed section, at the pile of broken slabs. Torbjörg says the method is sound. She says you have a chance. Torbjörg says many things. She is usually right. Halvor set down a length of timber and straightened his back. I still think you would have been better off selling. I still think the odds are against you, but... He paused, as if the next words cost him something. I have been wrong before. It was not an apology. It was not even an admission, but it was something. Thank you for the timber, Marit said. Thank Torbjörg. I owed her. He climbed back onto the wagon seat. I will come by after the first hard cold. If you are alive, I will admit I was wrong. If you are not... He stopped. I will come by after the first hard cold. He drove away without finishing the thought. December became a siege. Marit rebuilt the collapsed section with the timber braces Halvor had provided, wedging the boards against the outer wall at an angle that held the stone in place. It was ugly. Torbjörg was right about that, but it held. The west wall rose again, course by course, until it reached the height of the north wall. She added a low bench along the stove side, built from flat slabs stacked 3 deep. The bench was not for sitting, it was for sleeping. The girls could lie on it, wrapped in blankets, and absorb the heat that radiated from the stones beneath them. She lined part of the east wall, the side where the wind hit hardest. She did not have enough stone to cover it completely, but she covered the worst of it, the corner where the gaps between the boards were widest, the section where frost formed first on cold mornings. By mid-December, the shanty had been transformed. The walls were dark with stone, the floor crowded with mass, the air itself different, warmer, heavier, slower to change. The room was smaller now, the living space reduced by a third, but what remained felt different. It felt held. Torbjörn came for a final inspection on the 20th of December. "The stove corner is good," she said. "The north wall is good. The west wall will hold if the braces hold. The east wall," she shrugged, "the east wall is what it is. You ran out of time. Will it be enough?" Torbjörn did not answer directly. "I've seen worse shelters survive worse winters. I have seen better shelters fail in milder ones." She looked at Marit with something that might have been respect. "The stone is not magic. It does not create heat from nothing. It only holds what you give it. If you fire correctly, if you charge the walls by day and bank the stove at night, if you discipline yourself to steady warmth instead of desperate heat." She paused. "Then you have a chance. A real chance. Better than Halvor thinks. Better than Emmett Kroll wants. And if I fail?" "Then you fail." Torbjörn pulled her coat tighter. "But you do not fail because the method was wrong. You fail because the winter was worse than the method could handle. That is a different kind of failure." She left that afternoon and did not return for 2 weeks. Later, Marit learned that she had been tending to another widow 12 miles east, a woman whose husband had died of a fever in November and who had no one else to help her prepare. Torbjörn Vik collected debts and paid them forward in equal measure. She was not kind exactly, but she was useful, and in a Dakota winter, useful mattered more than kind. Christmas came and went with little celebration. Marit had nothing to give the girls except warmth and food, and both of those were measured resources now. She rationed the wood. She rationed the flour. She rationed the lamp oil until the evenings were lit only by the glow of the stove. But the shanty held heat the way Torbjörn had promised. On cold nights, the girls slept on the stone bench and woke without frost on their blankets. On the coldest mornings, the room was cold, but not killing cold. Not the knife-edged cold that Marit remembered from the first weeks of October, when the walls were bare boards and the heat fled as soon as the fire dropped. She began to believe it might work. She began to believe she might survive. January opened with deceptive mildness. The 12th of January, 1888, dawned warm. Warm for Dakota in winter, at least. Warm enough that the frost on the window softened by mid-morning. Warm enough that water dripped from the eaves. Warm enough that the children asked to go outside. And Marit said yes, because the sun was bright and the wind was calm. And for one day, one single day, the world felt like it might be merciful. Christy was outside for perhaps an hour. She came back in flushed and laughing, her cheeks red from the cold, and Marit thought nothing of it. That night, Christy woke coughing. By morning, she was hot with fever. By noon, she was too weak to sit up. Marit pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead and watched the sky through the single window. The mildness was holding. The clouds were high and thin. If the weather stayed gentle, she could manage this, keep the stove fed, keep Christy warm, keep everything balanced until the fever broke. At 2 p.m, the wind shifted. It came from the northwest like something alive, a wall of cold that hit the shanty with physical force. The boards creaked, the window rattled, the temperature, which had been hovering near freezing, plunged. Marit went to the door and opened it a crack. The sky had turned. The high thin clouds were gone, replaced by a low ceiling of gray-black that seemed to press down on the prairie like a hand. Snow was already beginning to fall, not the lazy flakes of a gentle storm, but hard pellets that stung the skin and scattered across the frozen grass like salt. She closed the door and latched it. "Mama?" Eli's voice was small. "What is happening?" "A storm is coming." Marit's voice was calm, though her heart was racing. A bad one. Within an hour, the storm had become something else entirely. The wind did not gust, it roared. It found every gap in the boards, every crack in the chinking, every weakness that the mild autumn had hidden. Snow drove through the seams in horizontal sheets, piling on the floor, crusting the stone walls with white. Marit fed the stove. She fed it steadily, the way Torbjörn had taught her. Small wood, often, coals instead of flame. The iron box glowed dull red. Heat radiated outward into the stone walls, into the lined corners, into the mass that she had spent 3 months building. Christy lay on the stone bench, wrapped in every blanket Marit owned. Her breathing was shallow, her cough wet and rattling. Eli sat beside her, holding her hand, watching her mother work with eyes that held too much understanding for an 8-year-old. Outside, the world ended. Marit could not see 3 feet beyond the window. The snow was not falling, it was flying, driven horizontal by wind that had to be 60 miles an hour or more. The temperature, she could not measure it, but she could feel it. Every breath of air that found its way through the cracks was sharp as a blade. She hung blankets over the door seam. She stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frame. She pulled the children's bed away from the east wall, where the stone was thinnest, and pushed it against the stove corner, where the mass was deepest. The stove devoured wood. She had rationed carefully for weeks, but now she fed it without counting, a piece every few minutes, keeping the coals alive, keeping the heat flowing into the stone that was her only defense. At 6 in the evening, the light died. The storm had blocked out everything: sun, moon, stars. The world was gray noise and white chaos, and at the center of it, Marit's 10 by 12 shanty hunched like an animal waiting to die. By 8 in the evening, the east wall was failing, not collapsing. The timber braces held, the stone stayed in place, but failing in the way that mattered. The cold was coming through. The section where Marit had not had enough stone to complete the lining was radiating winter into the room, the bare boards frosted white, the gaps glittering with ice. She dragged the last of the loose stone from the corner where she had stockpiled it and piled it against the base of the east wall, a makeshift barrier that would do nothing to stop the cold but might slow it down. Her fingers were numb by the time she finished. Christie's coughing worsened. She was awake now, her eyes glassy with fever, her small body shaking despite the blankets piled on her. Eli held her sister's hand and did not speak. "Mama needs to keep the fire going," Marit said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm for what was happening. "Keep Christy warm. Keep her close to the stones." She returned to the stove and fed it another piece of wood. The coals were red. The iron sides were hot. The stone walls nearest the stove were warm to the touch. Warm, even as the wind screamed and the temperature outside plunged towards something unsurvivable. Marit pressed her palm against the stone and felt the heat there, the stored warmth of 12 hours of steady firing. The wall was holding what she had given it. Whether it would hold long enough, give back enough, was a question that only the next hours could answer. At midnight, the stove pipe began to backsmoke. Marit smelled it first, the acrid bite of smoke and air that should have been clean. She looked up and saw gray wisps curling from the seams around the pipe collar, gathering against the ceiling, drifting through the room. The wind had found the flue. It was forcing air down the pipe faster than the fire could push it up, and the smoke that should have been climbing into the night was instead backing into the shanty. Marit opened the fire door and pulled the coals forward with the poker, trying to create more draw. The smoke thickened. The children began to cough, Christie's wet rattle joined by Eli's sharp bark. She adjusted the damper. No change. She opened the stove door wider, hoping fresh air would help. The smoke billowed out, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs. For one terrible moment, Marit thought she had made a fatal mistake. She had built a stone chamber to hold heat, and now that chamber was filling with smoke, and she could not stop it, and her children were choking, and the storm was screaming, and she grabbed a blanket, wet it with water from the kettle, and draped it over Christie's face. "Breathe through this," she told Eli. "Both of you. Stay low." Then she pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and opened the door. The wind hit her like a fist. She staggered, caught herself on the door frame, and forced her body out into the maelstrom. She could not see the woodpile 10 feet away. She could not see her own hands in front of her face. She could only feel the cold, the devastating cold that bit through her coat and her skin and her flesh and reached for the warmth of her blood. She found the corner of the shanty by feel. She found the base of the stovepipe by memory. She reached up, blind, her hands already numb, and felt for the pipe cap that Torbjörn had insisted she install. The cap had shifted. The wind had caught its edge and tilted it, opening a gap where the air could force its way down. Marit grabbed it with frozen fingers and wrenched it back into place, pressing it down against the pipe until she felt the seal close. She stumbled back to the door. She fell through it, ice crusting her eyelashes, her lungs burning with cold. The wind slammed the door shut behind her. The smoke was already clearing. The draw had returned. The fire was pulling air upward again, venting the smoke out into the storm. Marit lay on the floor and breathed. The worst came at 3 a.m. The temperature had dropped to something beyond measurement, beyond comprehension. Cold that made the boards crack like gunshots. Cold that frosted the inside of the window so thick Marit could not see through it. Cold that crept through every gap and seam and whispered of death in the spaces between the stones. Marit was out of wood. She had burned through her rationed supply, burned through her reserve, burned through the scraps she had been saving for emergencies. The stove held coals still, but they were fading. In an hour, maybe less, they would be ash. She looked at the stone walls in the dim light of the dying fire. They had been warm at midnight. They were still warm now, not hot, not comfortable, but warm. Warmer than the air, warmer than the boards on the east side, which were rimed with frost, warmer than anything else in the room except the stove itself. If she had more wood, she could charge them again. She could rebuild the heat, restore what the night had stolen. But she did not have more wood, and the storm showed no sign of stopping, and her children were huddled on the stone bench with their breath visible in the air. Marit did the only thing she could do. She lay down beside them. She pulled the blankets over all 3 of them, herself, Eli, Christie, and pressed their bodies against the warm stone beneath them. She wrapped her arms around her daughters and held them close, adding her own heat to the heat the stone was giving back. "Mama?" Eli's voice was barely a whisper. "Are we going to die?" Marit thought about lying. She thought about saying something brave, something comforting, something a mother was supposed to say. "I do not know," she said instead. "But if we do, we will do it together. And if we do not, it will be because we did not give up." Christie was asleep, or unconscious, Marit could not tell which. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her fever still burning even as the room grew cold. Eli nodded. She pressed closer to her mother and closed her eyes. Marit lay awake, watching the stove glow fade from red to orange to a dull cherry that barely lit the room. She felt the stone beneath her, still warm, still giving back the heat she had poured into it over hours and hours of steady firing. The air grew colder. Her breath hung visible in the darkness. The wind screamed on, endless and merciless. But the stone held. She woke to gray light and silence. The storm had passed. Marit sat up slowly, her body stiff with cold, and looked around the shanty. The stove was dead, the coals long since turned to ash, Frost covered every surface that was not stone. The window was opaque with ice. But the children were alive. Christy was still feverish, still weak, but she was breathing. Eli was awake, watching Marit with eyes that held something like wonder. "The stones are still warm," Eli said. Marit reached down and pressed her palm to the bench. It was barely warm now, just above the temperature of the room, but it was not cold. After all those hours, after the fire dying and the storm raging and the temperature dropping to killing levels, the stone was not cold. It had held what she had given it. It had given it back, slowly, through the night. It had not been enough for comfort, but it had been enough for survival. Marit stood on legs that did not want to hold her. She went to the door, braced herself, and opened it. The world outside was white and still. Snow drifted against the shanty in waves that reached nearly to the window. The sky was clear, brilliant blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. She could see across the prairie for the first time in hours. She could see the section road, buried under 3 feet of drift. She could see smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. Some chimneys, not all. She could see a figure struggling through the snow toward her shanty. Torbjörg arrived at the door with frost in her eyebrows and tears frozen to her cheeks. "You are alive," she said. "We are alive." Torbjörg pushed past her into the shanty. She went to the stove, checked the children, pressed her palm to the stone walls. Her face was unreadable. "The Hendricksons are dead," she said. "The husband and the 2 oldest. The wife and baby may survive, but I do not know. Halvor found them this morning. They burned everything they had by midnight and could not keep the house warm." Marit said nothing. She did not know the Hendricksons. The Johnson boy nearly froze trying to cross from the barn to the house. He was 50 feet from the door and could not find it in the snow. His father found him this morning, curled against the barn wall. He may lose both feet. Torbjörg turned to face Marit. "It was the worst storm in living memory. People are saying the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. People are saying dozens are dead across the territory, maybe hundreds." "The stones held," Marit said. It was all she could think to say. "I know." Torbjörg looked at the walls, at the mass of dark slate that lined 3 sides of the tiny room. "I knew they would. I just—" She stopped. "I was not certain. I hoped, I believed, but I was not certain until now." She sank onto the edge of the stone bench and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook just once before she controlled herself. "Christy is sick," Marit said. "The fever started yesterday, before the storm." Torbjörg looked at the child, still wrapped in blankets, still breathing shallowly. "The crisis will come today or tomorrow. If she survives the fever, she survives. There is nothing more we can do except keep her warm. The stones are cooling. Then we heat them again." Torbjörg stood. "I brought wood. Not much, but enough for today. Halvor is gathering more. Half the county will be sharing fuel by nightfall, those who have it with those who need it." She paused at the door. "Including you. You kept them alive, Marit. You kept them alive when the fire died. Do you understand what that means?" Marit did not answer. She was too tired to understand anything. "It means the stone worked. It means you were right, and everyone who doubted you was wrong." Torbjörg opened the door into the blinding white. "Rest now. I will bring wood. Tonight we fire the walls again, and tomorrow we see if your daughter lives." She left. The door closed. The shanty was quiet except for the children's breathing and the faint tick of ice melting from the rafters. Marit stood in the cold room she had built with 3 months of labor and one woman's knowledge and more faith than she had known she possessed. The worst had come. They had survived. And somewhere, in the spaces between the stones, warmth still lingered. Christie's fever broke on the 14th of January. She woke hungry for the first time in 3 days, and Marit wept into the flour while making her porridge. The territory was still counting its dead. The storm that people would later call the children's blizzard had killed hundreds. School children caught on the prairie, farmers lost between house and barn, entire families frozen in shanties that could not hold heat through the night. The numbers grew each day as search parties found more bodies in drifts and dugouts and half-finished shelters across Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota. Marit's shanty had held. Her children had lived, and word was spreading. Halvor Brekka came on the third day after the storm, when the roads were passable again and the drifts had been cut through enough for wagon traffic. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway and looked at the stone walls as if seeing them for the first time, though he had stood in the same room 4 months earlier and predicted their failure. "May I come in?" Marit stepped aside. Halvor walked the perimeter the way he had walked it in September, touching the walls, pressing his palm flat against the stone, feeling the faint warmth that still lingered even though the fire had been banked for hours. He crouched at the base of the north wall and examined the clay packing between the courses. He stood at the stove corner and measured, with his eyes, the thickness of the mass surrounding the heat source. "The Hendricksons had more wood than you," he said finally. "They had better walls, tighter chinking, newer boards. They had a bigger stove and a full woodshed when the storm hit." "I know." "They are dead." Halvor turned to face her. The husband and the 2 oldest children. The wife lost 3 fingers to frostbite, and the baby may not walk right. Their house was cold by 2 in the morning, and there was nothing they could do about it. Marit waited. She had learned that Halvor said what he meant to say in his own time. "I thought you were foolish," he said. "I thought you were stubborn and proud and determined to die rather than admit you had lost. I told you to sell. I told you that your children would freeze before that wall learned pity." He paused. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air between them. Marit had imagined this moment, the vindication, the satisfaction of proving the skeptic wrong. But now that it was here, she felt nothing like satisfaction. She felt tired. "You were not entirely wrong," she said. "The wall did not learn pity. It held heat because that is what stone does. I just understood what it could do and built accordingly. That is exactly what I was wrong about." Halvor moved to the stone bench where the children had slept through the worst of the storm. He sat on it, heavily, like a man who had been carrying weight for a long time. "I thought the question was how much you could burn, how hot you could make the fire, how long you could keep it fed. I thought survival was about fuel." He looked up at her. "You understood that survival was about what happened after the fuel ran out." "Torbjörg taught me." "Torbjörg pointed you in the right direction. You did the work." He stood. "I owe you an apology, Marit Asen. I came to your house and told you that you would die. I told you to give up everything you had left because I could not imagine any other outcome. And you—" He stopped, searching for words. "You built something I did not think was possible. You built a house that could survive without fire. It still needs fire. It just needs less of it. And it holds what fire gives longer." "Yes." Halvor nodded slowly. "That is exactly what I should have understood and did not." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Others will come. Others who lost people, who nearly lost people, who saw what happened and want to know how you survived when so many did not. Will you teach them?" "Yes." "Good." He opened the door into the bright cold of the January afternoon. "I will send them. Anyone who asks, I will send to you." He looked back at her one more time. "I judged the wrong thing, Marit." I will not make that mistake again. He left. The door closed. Marit stood in the warm room she had built and felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. Something earned. Beret Moen came 2 days later with her husband Eric, who had returned from Brookings the day after the storm, and found his family alive only because Beret had kept a fire burning through the night by breaking apart furniture when the wood ran low. "Show me," Eric said. He was a big man with hands like shovels, skeptical by nature, unwilling to believe anything he had not seen for himself. "Beret says you have walls that hold heat. Show me how." Marit showed him. She walked him through the construction, the sorting by weight, the fitting of courses, the clay and ash packing, the timber braces that held the stone against the outer boards. She showed him how the stove corner was built deeper than the other walls, how the mass there absorbed the most direct heat and radiated it back longest. She showed him the bench where her children had slept through the coldest hours. Eric listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pressed his palm against the north wall and held it there for a long moment. "It is warm," he said. "The fire has been banked for how long?" 4 hours. 4 hours, and the wall is still warm. He shook his head slowly. "I would not have believed it if I had not felt it." "Neither would I before I tried." Eric looked at his wife. Something passed between them, the silent communication of people who had been married long enough to speak without words. "We have a section of our house that never warms properly," he said. "The north corner, where the wind hits hardest. Every winter we lose heat there faster than we can replace it. If I brought stone from the creek, could you show me how to build a wall like this?" "I can show you, but it is work. Hard work, and it must be done correctly or the wall will fail." "I am not afraid of work." "Then bring stone. I will show you what I know." By the end of January, 3 families had begun stone lining projects of their own. None of them attempted what Marit had done, a full interior skin on multiple walls. That was too much labor, too much stone, too much disruption to a house that was already occupied. But they built what they could: stove corners reinforced with mass, sleeping alcoves backed with heated stone, low benches along the coldest walls where children could lie and absorb warmth through the night. Marit taught them what Torbjörg had taught her: sort by weight, build in courses, pack the gaps with clay and ash, fire steady instead of hot. She showed them how to test stone for density by listening to its ring. She showed them how to angle the lower courses so the weight pressed inward instead of outward. She did not charge for the teaching. She had nothing and everything had been given to her. Torbjörg's knowledge, Halvor's timber, the labor of her own desperate hands. Charging for it felt wrong, like selling water to a drowning person. But the teaching took time. And time was something Marit had little of, with 2 children to feed and a claim to prove, and a stove note still outstanding. Emmett Kroll came in early February, when the snow was still deep, but the roads were clear enough for his fine wagon and matched bays. He did not come alone. He brought a man Marit did not recognize, a tall, thin figure in a city coat, who carried a notebook and asked questions about property lines and water rights and the legal status of her claim. "Mrs. Asen." Emmett's smile was the same as it had been in September, broad and warm and utterly false. "I heard you survived the storm. Remarkable, truly remarkable." "Mr. Kroll." "I wanted to introduce you to Mr. Fellows. He's a land agent from Sioux Falls looking at properties in the area. I mentioned your claim, and he expressed interest." Marit looked at the land agent, then back at Emmett. "My claim is not for sale." Of course, I'm not here to pressure you." Emmett spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "But Mr. Fellows is offering good prices for land in this area. Better than I could offer, certainly. And I thought, given your circumstances, my circumstances have changed. Have they? Emmett's smile tightened slightly. You still owe on that stove. You still have 2 children to feed. The blizzard may have passed, but winter is not over, and spring planting requires capital you do not have. He lowered his voice, as if sharing a confidence. I am trying to help you, Marit. I know we got off on the wrong foot in September, but I'm a businessman, not a villain. If you need to sell, I want you to get the best price possible. I do not need to sell. Perhaps not today, but think about it. He gestured to the land agent. Mr. Fellows will be in the area for another week. If you change your mind, I will not change my mind. Emmett's smile finally died. You know, people are talking about you, about your stone walls and your, what do they call it? Your heat holding method. Some people are saying you're clever. Some people are saying you got lucky. And some people... He paused, letting the silence do his work for him. Some people are saying you survived because others shared their wood with you, that without Halvor Breake's charity, you would have frozen like everyone else. That is not true. Isn't it? Halvor brought you timber. Torbjörn Vik brought you wood after the storm. The Moen family shared fuel when your supply ran low. Emmett shook his head sadly. I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I'm saying that hard work and good neighbors might explain your survival better than piled up rocks. Marit felt the anger rising in her chest, the same anger she had felt when Halvor first predicted her death, when Beret first questioned her sanity, when Emmett first offered to buy her failure. But she had learned something in the months since September. She had learned that anger was fuel, and fuel was precious, and wasting it on men like Emmett Kroll was worse than wasting wood. Mr. Kroll, she said, the Hendricksons had more wood than I did. They had better walls and a bigger stove and no stone lining at all. They are dead. The Johnsons had a full woodshed and a tight house and 20 years of experience on this prairie. Their son may never walk again. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I survived because I understood something they did not. I survived because I built something that worked when fire alone could not. And I will continue to survive, Mr. Kroll, with or without your help, with or without your land agent, with or without your permission. She turned to the land agent, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort. My claim is not for sale, Mr. Fellows. Not today, not in a week, not ever. I suggest you look elsewhere. The land agent glanced at Emmett, then back at Marit. I understand, Mrs. Assen. My apologies for the intrusion. He turned and walked back toward the wagon. Emmett lingered a moment longer. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Pride is expensive on the frontier. Sooner or later, you'll need something you can't build with rocks and stubbornness. And when that day comes, Mr. Kroll, I will find a way. The same way I found a way through the blizzard, the same way I will find a way through whatever comes next. She opened the door of the shanty and stood aside. Goodbye. Emmett left without another word. But Marit saw the look in his eyes as he climbed into his wagon, not defeat, but calculation. He was not done with her. He was simply waiting for a better opportunity. She closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The anger was still there, burning in her chest, but beneath it was something else, something that felt like strength. February turned toward March, and the teaching continued. Marit and Torbjörn worked together now, dividing the labor of instruction between them. Torbjörn handled the technical details, the sorting and fitting and packing that required experience to get right. Marit handled the philosophy, the understanding of why stone held heat and how to fire a stove to charge the walls instead of just warming the air. They disagreed sometimes. Torbjörn believed in building thick, 4 inches minimum, 6 where possible. Marit had learned that placement mattered more than thickness, that a thin wall in the right location could outperform a thick wall in the wrong one. You are teaching shortcuts, Torbjörn said one afternoon, watching Marit show Erik Mohn how to build a partial stove corner instead of a full wall. Shortcuts fail. I am teaching what people can actually build, Marit replied. Not everyone has 3 months to haul stone. Not everyone has the strength to lift what a full wall requires. If we teach only the perfect method, no one will build anything. And if they build the imperfect method and it fails, then they learn. They improve. They build again. Marit set down the stone she was holding and faced her teacher. You taught me the right way, but I survived because I understood the principle, not because I followed every rule perfectly. The collapse, the thin sections, the east wall that never got finished, none of that mattered in the end. What mattered was that I had enough mass in the right places to hold heat through the night. Torbjörn was quiet for a long moment. You are not wrong, she said finally. But I have seen what happens when people take principles without understanding them. They build once, it fails, and they never try again. They tell everyone the method does not work, when what they mean is that their version of the method did not work. Then we teach understanding, not just technique. That is harder. Yes. Marit picked up the stone again. But it is what you taught me. You did not just show me how to stack rock. You showed me why the rock mattered. That is what I am trying to pass on. Torbjörn nodded slowly. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I have been teaching the wrong thing all along. She almost smiled. Perhaps the student has something to teach the teacher. It was as close to praise as Torbjörn ever came. The collaboration deepened through March. Together, they developed a simplified system, what Marit called the stove bank, that could be built in a week instead of 3 months. It was not a full wall, just a mass of stacked stone behind and beside the stove, rising to waist height and packed with clay at the joints. It would not transform a house the way Marit's full system had, but it would help. It would hold some heat, extend some warmth, make some difference on the coldest nights. Torbjörn shared more of herself as they worked. She told Marit about the daughter she had lost, Anna, 3 years old, taken by the cold in a winter that had seemed survivable until it was not. She told her about the husband who had blamed her for the death and left the following spring, walking away from everything they had built together. That is when I learned about heat, Torbjörn said. After Anna, after Johan left. I had nothing except time and anger, and I used both to understand what had killed my child. She paused, her hands still on the stone she was fitting. The cold did not kill her. The house killed her. The house that could not hold what the stove gave. If I had known then what I know now. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. You taught me, Marit said. You saved my daughters. That matters. It does not bring Anna back. No, but it means her death was not meaningless. It means something came from it, something that will help others. Torbjörn looked at her with an expression Marit had never seen before, something raw and unguarded, something that might have been grief or gratitude or both. You understand? She said quietly. I was not sure anyone would. Torbjörn fell ill in late March when the snow was beginning to melt and the first hints of spring were showing in the brown grass emerging from the drifts. It started as a cough, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Everyone coughed in late winter when the air was still cold and the confinement of months indoors weakened the lungs. But Torbjörn's cough deepened instead of fading. She began to tire more easily, to pause mid-sentence as if searching for breath, to sit when she should have been standing. Marit brought her soup. Torbjörg refused it. I have been ill before, she said. I have survived worse than this. You are not well? I am not young. Torbjörg smiled, thin and tired. There is a difference. But the illness worsened. By early April, Torbjörg could not walk to the shanty anymore. Marit went to her instead, bringing food and firewood and sitting with her through the long afternoons while the snow melted outside. You know what to do, Torbjörg said one afternoon. Her voice was barely a whisper, her face gray with exhaustion. You do not need me anymore. I need you. For what? For company? You have daughters for company? For teaching? You teach better than I do now. For understanding? Torbjörg's eyes found hers and held them. You understood before I taught you anything. I just showed you how to build what you already knew. That is not true. It is true. The stone by the kettle, the memory of your mother's house. You knew that heat could be stored before you ever met me. She coughed, hard and wet, and Marit held her until it passed. I just helped you believe it. Marit stayed until dark. When she left, Torbjörg was sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady. She died 3 days later in the night, alone in the house she had shared with a husband and daughter who were both gone. Marit found her in the morning, still in bed, her face peaceful in a way it had never been in life. Marit buried Torbjörg beside Anna and Johann's empty plot in the small cemetery behind the church. The ground was soft enough to dig now, the frost finally loosened by the April sun. A dozen people came, more than Marit had expected, fewer than Torbjörg deserved. Halvor spoke a few words. Prairie brought flowers from her root cellar, force bulbs that had been waiting for spring. Eric Moen helped lower the coffin. Marit stood at the grave after the others had gone and tried to find words for what she felt. Gratitude, grief, the strange loneliness of being the one who remained. I will not build it the way you showed me, she said quietly, remembering Torbjörg's final instruction. I will build it the way the room asks. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth. Spring was coming. The worst was over. And somewhere in the ground beneath her feet, a woman who had lost everything had finally found rest. Marit walked home in the fading light. The shanty was warm when she arrived, warm from the stone walls that Torbjörg had helped her build, warm from the fire that had been tended in her absence, warm from the life that continued inside while death claimed its due outside. She stood in the doorway and looked at what she had built. Not just the walls, not just the method, but the understanding that had come with it. The knowledge that heat could be held, that cold could be survived, that one woman with enough determination could build something that changed how people lived. That was Torbjörg's gift. Not the technique, but the belief that the technique was possible. Marit closed the door and began preparing supper. The secondary crisis came in late April, when the snowmelt flooded Split Rock Creek and a family named Lindgren was trapped on the wrong side of the water with a sick child and no way to cross. Marit heard about it from Halvor, who rode to her door at dusk with mud on his boots and urgency in his voice. They have a boy, maybe 7 years old, lung fever. The mother sent a message this morning asking for help, but the creek is impassable. 3 feet of fast water over the ford and rising. Can you go around? 8 miles north to the next crossing, 8 miles back. By the time anyone reaches them. He did not finish. He did not need to. What can I do? The schoolhouse. Halvor pointed east toward the small building that served the section. If the creek does not drop by morning, we will need to shelter people there. Families from the low ground anyone whose house floods. The schoolhouse has a stove, but the building is drafty and poorly built. Last winter it took 2 cords of wood to heat it through a single cold night. Marit understood. You want me to line it. I want you to do whatever you can. Build a bank, a wall, whatever will help the stove hold heat longer. There are children who may need that building for days if the water does not recede. I cannot line a schoolhouse in a day. Then do what you can. Halvor's voice was steady, but his eyes held something close to fear. We have stone stockpiled from Eric Mohn's project. We have timber. We have hands willing to help. He paused. We have you. Marit looked at the shanty behind her, the warm, solid structure she had built with months of labor and one woman's teaching. She thought about Torbjörg, buried 3 weeks now, who had taught her not just how to stack stone, but how to think about heat. I will need help, she said. Halvor, Eric, Beret if she can come, and we work through the night if necessary. I will gather them. And I will need someone to tell me about the schoolhouse, how large, how the stove sits, where the drafts are worst. Beret knows it. Her children go there. Then bring her first. Marit was already reaching for her coat. And bring every flat stone you can carry. We do not have time to sort for perfection. We build with what we have and hope it is enough. The schoolhouse was worse than Marit had imagined. 16 feet by 20, with a potbelly stove near the center that radiated heat in all directions and warmed nothing effectively. The walls were single-board construction with gaps she could see daylight through. The floor was bare earth packed hard by years of children's feet. In winter, Beret said, the children nearest the stove sweated while the children along the walls froze. Where does the heat go? Marit asked, walking the perimeter. Everywhere, nowhere. Beret pointed at the north wall. That side is worst. The wind comes through like the boards are not even there. Marit pressed her palm to the boards. Even in April, with mild weather outside, the wall was cold. She thought about Torbjörg's voice. The stone does not create heat from nothing. It only holds what you give it. The problem was not the stove. The problem was that the stove was heating air that escaped as fast as it was warmed. No amount of fuel would fix that. The only solution was mass, something to absorb the stove's heat and hold it, to stop the constant bleeding of warmth through the inadequate walls. We cannot line the walls, she said. Not in the time we have. But we can build a bank around the stove, a ring of stone, waist high, close enough to absorb the radiation. If we build it thick enough and charge it before people arrive, will it work? Marit thought about her own shanty on the night of the blizzard, when the fire died and only the stone remained. It will help. How much depends on how much we can build before morning. They worked through the night. Halvor and Eric hauled stone from the stockpile. Marit and Beret sorted and stacked, building a crude ring around the potbelly stove. Not the careful courses she had used in her shanty, but a rough mass of flat slabs piled 3 feet high and packed with mud from the swollen creek. The work was hard and fast and imperfect. Stones shifted and had to be reset. Mud ran thin and had to be thickened with ash. The ring grew lopsided and had to be balanced with counterweights on the heavy side. But by dawn, they had something. Not a wall, not even a proper bank, but a mass of stone surrounding the stove like a collar, close enough to absorb the heat, thick enough to hold it for hours after the fire dropped. Marit fired the stove hard, the way Torbjörg had taught her not to. But there was no time for steady warming, no hours to charge the stone gently. She needed heat in the mass now, as much as possible before the refugees arrived. By mid-morning, the first families came. The Lindgren boy had survived the night. though his fever was still high. His mother carried him into the schoolhouse and laid him on a bench near the stone ring, where the warmth radiated outward in waves. More families followed. 8 people by noon, 14 by afternoon. By evening, 23 people were sheltered in the schoolhouse, including 6 children under 10 and 2 elders too frail to help with anything but staying alive. The stove burned constantly. Marit fed it in shifts with the other adults, keeping the coals alive, keeping the heat flowing into the stone ring. The ring was not elegant and not pretty, but it worked. It absorbed the stove's output and radiated it back slowly, evenly, in all directions, instead of straight up to the rafters. On the second night, the wood supply ran low. The ring was warm enough, heated through 2 days of constant firing, that Marit let the fire drop to coals for 3 hours while they waited for more fuel. The schoolhouse stayed warm, not comfortable, not hot, but warm enough. The stone held what the fire had given it and released it slowly through the night. The Lindgren boys' fever broke on the 3rd morning. The creek dropped enough to ford on the 4th. By the 5th day, everyone had gone home. Marit stood in the empty schoolhouse and looked at the rough stone ring she had built. It was ugly. It was crude. It was nothing like the careful work she had done in her own home, but it had kept 23 people alive through 4 days of emergency. It had proved that the method worked not just in one woman's shanty, but anywhere there was stone and will and understanding. Torbjörn would have approved. The knock came 2 days later, late in the evening, when Marit was putting the children to bed. She opened the door to find Emmett Kroll standing on her threshold. He was alone this time. No land agent, no wagon, just a man with his hat in his hands and an expression she had never seen on his face before. "Mrs. Assen." His voice was different, too, quieter. "I wonder if I might have a word." Marit considered closing the door in his face. She considered telling him to leave and never return. But something in his posture stopped her, something that looked almost like humility. "Come in." He entered the shanty and stood awkwardly near the door, as if unsure he was welcome to go further. His eyes moved across the stone walls, the lined corners, the mass that had kept her family alive through the worst winter in memory. "The schoolhouse," he said finally. "I heard what you did, building the stone ring in one night, keeping all those people warm when the wood ran low." He paused. "The Lindgren boy, he's my wife's nephew. Ellen's sister married a Lindgren 10 years ago." Marit said nothing. She waited. "I have a building at the depot," Emmett continued. "The back room where I store goods over winter. It is never heated properly. Every year I lose merchandise to cold damage. Flour, molasses, anything that freezes. I've tried everything. Better stove, more wood, sealing the walls. Nothing works." "You want me to line it?" "I want you to show me how." He met her eyes, and Marit saw something there she had not expected, not defeat, but recognition. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Asen. I was wrong about the method. I thought you were a fool who would die of pride, and instead you built something that—" He stopped, searching for words. "Something that changes things." "It does not change what you tried to do. You wanted my claim. You wanted to profit from my failure." "Yes." He did not deny it. "I am a businessman. I see opportunity where others see tragedy. It is not a noble trait, but it is an honest one." He spread his hands. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for help. Help that I'm willing to pay for." Marit looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Torbjörn, who had helped her without asking for anything in return. She thought about Halvor, who had brought timber and admitted he was wrong. She thought about all the people who had come to her in the months since the blizzard, seeking knowledge that cost her nothing to share. Emmett Kroll was different. He had tried to exploit her. He had mocked her method and predicted her death. He had spread doubt about her survival, suggesting it was charity rather than innovation that had saved her. But he was also here, hat in hand, asking for help. And Torbjörn's voice echoed in her memory. Build it the way the room asks. Sometimes the room asked for generosity. Sometimes it asked for justice. And sometimes it asked for something harder, the willingness to help someone who did not deserve it, because the help mattered more than the history. The stove note, Marit said. What? I still owe you $12 on the stove. Cancel the debt, and I will show you how to line your storage room. Emmett blinked. That is, the note is worth. I know what it is worth, and I know what my knowledge is worth. Those are my terms. A long pause. Then slowly, Emmett Kroll nodded. The debt is canceled, he said. I will have papers drawn up tomorrow. Then bring stone to your storage room on Thursday. I will show you what I know. He left without another word. But at the door, he paused and looked back. You are remarkable, Mrs. Asen. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it to flatter. I say it because it is true. He put his hat on. I will see you Thursday. The door closed. Marit stood in the warm room and felt something ease in her chest, not the satisfaction of revenge, but something quieter, something like resolution. Torbjörn was gone, but the teaching continued, and even enemies could learn. The second winter came easier than the first, not because the cold was gentler, it was not, but because Marit understood it now. She understood what her walls could hold and what they could not. She understood how to fire the stove in long, steady burns that charged the stone without cracking it. She understood that survival was not about fighting the cold, but about holding warmth long enough for the cold to pass. By November of 1888, her shanty had become a destination. People came from as far as 20 miles away, riding through the first snow to see the woman who had survived the children's blizzard with a house full of river slate. Some came to learn, some came to doubt. Some came simply to stand in a room that stayed warm for hours after the fire dropped, to press their palms against stone that held heat like a living thing, to understand for themselves what they had only heard described. Marit taught them all. She taught Beret's eldest son how to sort stone by weight and ring. She taught the widow Peterson how to build a sleeping bench that would keep her arthritic joints warm through the night. She taught the school teacher, a young man from Ohio who had never experienced a prairie winter, how to maintain the stone ring at the schoolhouse so it would be ready if another emergency came. She did not teach the way Torbjörn had taught her, patient, precise, insisting on perfection before moving to the next step. She taught the way necessity demanded, fast, practical, focused on what mattered most. Sort the stone well enough, stack the courses tight enough, pack the gaps full enough, fire the stove steady enough. Enough was the key word. Perfection was impossible on the frontier, but enough could save lives. The man arrived on a December morning with a wagon full of lumber and a question. Marit was outside splitting kindling when she heard the wheels on the frozen ground. She straightened, axe in hand, and watched the wagon approach. A heavy freight rig loaded with cut timber, pulled by a team of draft horses that steamed in the cold air. The driver was perhaps 40, with a carpenter's hands and a face that had seen weather. He pulled the team to a stop near the shanty and climbed down with the careful movements of a man whose joints had started to protest. Mrs. Asen? Yes. Arne Vangen. He touched his hat. I have a delivery from Halvor Brekke, timber for your west wall reinforcement. Marit frowned. I did not order timber. Halvor ordered it, said your bracing was starting to bow under the weight and you were too stubborn to ask for help. He almost smiled. His words, not mine. Halvor talks too much. Halvor talks exactly as much as he needs to. Arna walked to the back of the wagon and began untying the load. I am a carpenter. Wagons mostly, but I know framing well enough. Halvor thought I could help reinforce the structure before the worst of winter. Marit watched him work. His movements were efficient, economical, no wasted motion, no hesitation. He knew his tools the way she knew her stone. You have come a long way to reinforce a wall, she said. Not 12 miles, not so far. He lifted a length of timber and set it beside the shanty. My wife died 2 years ago. Childbirth. The baby did not survive either. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. Since then, I have been looking for work that matters. Halvor said you were doing work that matters. Halvor is very free with his opinions about my work. He is also right about your bracing. Arna pointed at the west wall, where the timber supports were indeed beginning to bow outward under the weight of the stone. Another hard freeze and those will crack. Then the wool comes down and you start over. Marit looked at the bracing. She had noticed the bowing, but had told herself it would hold through the winter. She had told herself a lot of things in the months since the blizzard, some of them true, some of them hope dressed up as planning. What do you propose? New supports, diagonal bracing from floor to ceiling, anchored at both ends. It will take 2 days, maybe 3, and the wall will need to be partially dismantled while I work. He met her eyes. I do not charge for the labor, only the materials, and Halvor has already paid for those. Why? Because my wife would have wanted me to help people instead of drinking myself to death in Sioux Falls. He said it simply, as if stating the weather. And because I saw the schoolhouse ring. I saw what you built in one night with nothing but flat stone and determination. I would like to understand how you did it. Marit studied him for a long moment. He was not like the others who had come seeking knowledge, not desperate, not skeptical, not hungry for a quick solution to an immediate problem. He was curious. Curious the way Torbjörn had been curious, the way Marit herself was curious about the properties of heat and stone and time. The wall will need to be partially dismantled, she said. Yes. The children will be cold while you work. I will work fast. And you want me to teach you while you reinforce my house? I want to understand. He lifted another length of timber. Teaching is your decision. Understanding is mine. Marit set down the axe. Then we should begin before the weather turns. Arne Vangen worked on the west wall for 4 days. He was methodical in a way that reminded Marit of Torbjörn, measuring twice, cutting once, fitting each piece of timber as if it would be judged by God himself. But where Torbjörn had taught through lecture, Arne learned through observation. He watched Marit stack stone, watched her test the fit of each slab, watched her pack the joints with clay and ash. He asked questions only when he could not figure something out on his own. The angle of the courses, he said on the 3rd day. You tilt them inward. Why? So the weight presses down instead of out. The stone wants to fall. The angle makes it fall into itself. Like a corbelled arch. I do not know what that is. A way of building arches without mortar. Each stone overlaps the one below, angled inward until they meet at the top. He traced the shape in the air with his hands. The Romans used them. The weight of the upper stones holds the lower stones in place. Marit looked at her wall with new eyes. She had learned the angle from Torbjörn, who had learned it from experience, who had probably learned it from someone else who had learned it from necessity. She had never known there was a name for it, a history, a tradition that stretched back centuries. I did not know I was building Roman arches. You were not. You were building something that works. Arna set a timber brace into position and marked where it would anchor. The Romans had one solution. You have another. Both solutions come from the same principle. Weight can hold things together instead of pushing them apart. You know a great deal about building. I know a great deal about weight and balance. Wagons teach you that. A wagon that is loaded wrong will tip, or break an axle, or kill a horse trying to pull it. A wagon that is loaded right will carry anything. He began drilling the anchor hole. Your walls are loaded right. That is why they work. They worked side by side for 2 more days, and Marit found herself enjoying the companionship in a way she had not expected. Arna did not fill silence with chatter. He did not offer opinions unless asked. He simply worked and watched, and occasionally asked a question that made Marit think about what she was doing in a new way. When the reinforcement was complete, the west wall was stronger than it had ever been. The diagonal braces anchored the stone securely, and the whole structure had a solidity that the original construction had lacked. "It will hold now," Arne said, gathering his tools. "Another 20 winters if you maintain it." "I do not plan to be here for 20 winters." "No one plans anything on the frontier. Things happen anyway." He loaded the last of his equipment into the wagon. "Halvor says you are teaching at the schoolhouse next week, something about preparing for the next bad storm." "Yes. The stone ring needs to be rebuilt properly, and the community needs to understand how to maintain it." "I would like to attend, if you do not mind." Marit looked at him, at the careful way he stood, the patient expression, the hands that knew how to build things that lasted. "I do not mind," she said. The teaching at the schoolhouse drew 15 people, the largest gathering Marit had ever addressed. She stood beside the stone ring she had built in one frantic night and explained how it could be improved, proper courses instead of rough stacking, better clay packing, a second layer on the north side where the drafts were worst. She showed them how to test stone for density, how to fire a stove for charging instead of spiking, how to read the warmth of a wall by pressing a palm to it and counting heartbeats. Arna sat in the back and took notes in a small leather journal. Halvor stood by the door with his arms crossed, nodding occasionally. Beret asked questions that pushed Marit to explain things she had never put into words before. "What if the stone cracks?" someone asked. "What if it splits under the heat?" "Then you replace it. Cracks happen. The wall does not fail because one stone fails. The wall fails when you stop maintaining it." "How do you know when the wall is charged enough?" "You feel it. Palm flat against the surface, count to 10. If the stone is warmer than your hand, it is charged. If your hand is warmer than the stone, it needs more time." "How long will it hold?" "Depends on the thickness, the outside temperature, how well the room is sealed. A 4-inch wall in a tight room can hold warmth for 8 hours after the fire drops. A 2-inch wall in a drafty room might hold for 3. Marit paused. "The point is not to eliminate the fire. The point is to make the fire last longer, to flatten the curve between hot and cold, so the coldest hours are not as deadly." After the teaching, Arne approached her with his journal open. "You said something about flattening the curve," he said. "I have been thinking about it. The problem with heat is not creating it. Anyone can create heat with enough fuel. The problem is that heat leaves as soon as it arrives. You're not storing heat so much as slowing its departure." "Yes, that is exactly right." "Then the walls are not heaters. They are—" He searched for the word. "Brakes. They slow down the cold instead of speeding up the warm." Marit had never thought of it that way, but the moment he said it, she knew it was true. The stone did not create warmth from nothing. It simply held the door open a little longer, gave the heat a few more hours to work before the cold rushed in to replace it. "Brakes," she said. "Yes, I like that." Arna smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. I build wagons. I think about brakes often. The courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded through labor. Arne returned in January to help Marit add a fourth wall of stone, the east side, which had never been properly finished during the desperate months before the blizzard. He brought timber and nails and a steadiness that made the work go faster than it would have gone alone. They did not speak of romance or partnership. They spoke of angles and measurements and load-bearing capacity. They spoke of Torbjörg, whom Arne had never met, but whose presence Marit felt in every course she laid. They spoke of Anna and Johann, Torbjörg's lost daughter and vanished husband. They spoke of Arne's wife, whose name had been Kirsten, and who had loved to sing. In February, Arne asked if he could build a proper bed frame for the children, a raised platform that would keep them off the cold ground and closer to the warmth of the stone bench. Marit said yes. He built it in 3 days, with joints so tight they did not need pegs. In March, when the snow began to melt, he asked if she would consider letting him build an addition to the shanty, a proper room with framed walls and a foundation, something that could be lined with stone from the beginning instead of retrofitted. "That is a great deal of work," Marit said. "I have a great deal of time. It is also a great deal of commitment to the land, to the claim, to—" She stopped. "To you." Arne met her eyes. "Yes, I know." They stood in the doorway of the shanty, looking out at the muddy ground and the brown grass emerging from the melting snow. The children were inside, playing some game that involved a great deal of giggling and the occasional shriek. "I am not looking for a husband," Marit said. "I am not offering to be one. Not yet. Not unless you want me to." He turned to face her fully. "I am offering to help build something that lasts. Whether that includes marriage is your decision, not mine. And if I decide no, then I will build the addition anyway because it needs to be built, and I will leave when it is finished, and I will not trouble you again." He paused. "But I do not think you will decide no. I think you are lonely and proud and afraid of needing anyone after spending a year proving you could survive alone. I think you see partnership as weakness because you had a partner who left you when you needed him most." "Lars was not my partner. He was my brother-in-law." "He was supposed to help you. He did not. That is a kind of betrayal, whether or not he owed you anything." Arne's voice was gentle. "I am not Lars. I am not Gunnar either. I am just a carpenter who knows how to build things that last, who lost his family and found a reason to keep working, who would very much like to keep working beside you if you will let him." Marit looked at him for a long time. She thought about Torbjörg, who had helped her without asking anything in return. She thought about Halvor, who had brought timber and admitted he was wrong. She thought about all the ways she had learned to survive alone and all the ways that survival had cost her. "Build the addition," she said. "We will see what comes after." They married in June of 1889 in the small church where Torbjörg was buried. Halvor stood as witness. Beret brought flowers. The children wore new dresses that Marit had sewn from fabric bought with money earned from teaching, real money paid by families who wanted proper instruction instead of quick advice. The addition to the shanty was half finished by then, a proper room with framed walls and a stone foundation that Arne had laid himself. By autumn it would be complete, 2 rooms instead of 1, with a connecting door and a shared stove that heated both spaces through a system of radiant stone Marit had designed. They were not wealthy. They would never be wealthy. But they had shelter that worked, knowledge that mattered, and a partnership built on mutual respect instead of desperation. That was enough. On the frontier, enough was everything. The years compressed the way years do when they are full of work. 1889 brought the addition, the marriage, and the first payment toward owning the stove outright. Emmett Kroll signed over the canceled note with a grimace that Marit treasured privately. 1890 brought statehood to Dakota. Two states now, North and South, divided along a line that meant nothing to the people who lived on either side of it. It also brought Marit's first child with Arne, a boy they named Torsten after no one in particular except that the name felt right. 1891 brought a drought that tested the region's patience, followed by a winter that tested its endurance. Marit taught 18 families that year how to build stone banks, and every one of those families survived the February cold that killed livestock and froze wells, and reminded everyone that the frontier did not forgive weakness. 1892 brought Arne's wagon business to the homestead, a small operation at first, just repairs and modifications, but growing as word spread that he built things that lasted. The shop stood beside the house, and the sound of hammering and sawing became the rhythm of Marit's days. By 1895, the original shanty had disappeared entirely, absorbed into a proper farmhouse with 4 rooms, a kitchen with a real cook stove, and walls that held heat so well Marit sometimes had to open windows in the depths of winter to keep the air from growing stale. She still taught. Not as often now. There were others who could teach the basics, students who had become teachers themselves, but she taught the difficult cases, the families with impossible constraints, the widows who reminded her of herself, the stubborn ones who needed to understand the principle before they would trust the method. Emmett Kroll's final humiliation came in the winter of 1896, during a cold snap that froze the contents of his storage room despite the stone lining Marit had helped him build 7 years earlier. He came to the farmhouse on a January morning, hat in hand again, to ask what had gone wrong. Marit walked with him to the depot and inspected the storage room. The stone lining was intact, the stove functional, the construction sound. But the room was full of new merchandise, crates stacked to the ceiling, barrels crammed into every corner, boxes piled against the stone walls. "You have blocked the heat," she said. "What?" "The stone." She pointed at a wall of crates pressed directly against the lined section. "It cannot absorb warmth if there is no air between it and the stove. You have built a barrier between your heat source and your thermal mass." "But I needed the space." "Then you should have built a larger room or stored less merchandise or accepted that you cannot have everything you want." Marit turned to face him. "The method works when you use it correctly. You're not using it correctly." Emmett's face reddened. "I paid for this advice. I canceled your debt." "You paid for knowledge. What you do with the knowledge is your responsibility." She walked toward the door. "Move the crates away from the walls. Leave at least a foot of airspace. Fire the stove for a full day before restocking. The room will hold heat again." She left him standing in his frozen merchandise, surrounded by wealth that the cold was slowly destroying. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt only the mild weariness of dealing with someone who wanted results without understanding. That was Emmett Kroll's legacy, a man who could buy knowledge but could not earn wisdom. The frontier had a way of teaching such men, eventually. Some learned, some did not. Emmett fell somewhere in between, smart enough to survive, not wise enough to thrive. He moved the crates. The storage room worked again. And he never troubled Marit with questions after that, though she occasionally saw him in town and noted the way his eyes avoided hers. Halvor Brekke died in the spring of 1897, peacefully in the house he had built 40 years earlier. Marit attended the funeral with Arne and the children, 3 of them now, with Torsten joined by a daughter named Sigrid and another son on the way. She stood at the grave and remembered the man who had walked into her shanty 8 years earlier and told her she would die. He had been wrong about that, but he had been right about so much else, about the frontier's cruelty, about the cost of pride, about the value of admitting when you had misjudged something. He had brought her timber when she needed it. He had sent her students when she was ready to teach. He had acknowledged his error publicly, without excuse, and spent the rest of his life sending people to learn what he himself had dismissed. That was a kind of redemption, not dramatic, not complete, but real. The frontier offered few opportunities for grand gestures. It offered many opportunities for small corrections, steady improvements, the patient work of becoming slightly better than you were before. Marit said goodbye to Halvor Breke and walked home through the spring mud, her children running ahead and her husband beside her in the work of the farm waiting. The last teaching came in the winter of 1900, when Marit was 42 years old and her hair had begun to show gray. A woman arrived at the farmhouse on a December afternoon, young, perhaps 25, with a baby on her hip and exhaustion in her eyes. Her name was Anna, she said, and she had come from Minnesota to claim land her husband had filed on before he died of a fever in October. "I have nothing," Anna said. "A shanty I've never seen, money for maybe 2 months, and a child who cannot survive a winter without proper shelter." She looked at Marit with the desperation of someone who has run out of options. "They told me you could help. They told me you know how to make a household heat." Marit looked at this woman, this stranger with a dead husband and an impossible situation and a child too young to understand what was happening, and saw herself, 8 years distant, standing in a doorway with frost forming on the boards. "Come inside," she said. "We have a great deal to discuss." She taught Anna everything she knew. Not the simplified version, not the quick fixes, but the full method, the sorting and stacking and packing, the fire discipline, the principle behind the practice. She gave her stone from the stockpile Arna had built up over the years. She gave her timber from the scrap pile behind the wagon shop. She gave her food for the journey and blankets for the baby, and the address of 3 families along the way who would help if she needed it. Anna left on the 3rd day, her wagon loaded with materials and her head full of knowledge and her eyes holding something that might have been hope. "Why did you give her so much?" Eli asked. She was 16 now, tall and serious, already helping with the teaching. "Because someone gave me everything once," Marit said, "and I promised I would pass it forward. Torbjörn, and Halvor, and your father, who stayed when he could have left, and everyone who brought stone or timber or knowledge when I needed it." Marit put her arm around her daughter. "We survive alone, Eli, but we live because others help us. That is the principle behind everything I have ever taught." Marit Asen Vangen lived to see the new century arrive, and the automobile replace the wagon, and her children grow into adults with families of their own. She taught until her hands grew too stiff to demonstrate proper stone fitting, and then she taught by directing others. She saw the method spread beyond the county, beyond the state, into territories and regions she had never visited. She received letters from people she had never met, thanking her for knowledge that had saved their families, their livestock, their lives. She died in the spring of 1922, in the bedroom of the farmhouse she had built with Arne, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and the faint smell of wood smoke from the stove that still burned in the kitchen. The stone walls of that house are standing still. In the years after the children's blizzard, 37 families in southeastern Dakota learned to line their homes with river slate. 14 of those families taught others, and the method spread outward in widening circles until no one could trace its origin anymore. But those who remembered called it Marit's Way, or sometimes Asen Heat, and they knew it had started with a woman who refused to die when everyone said she would. Marit Asen Vangen remained on the Split Rock Creek homestead until her death at age 64. She outlived Arna by 3 years, outlived Halvor and Beret, and nearly everyone who had doubted her. In her final decade, she was known less for the stone walls than for the teaching, the patient, practical instruction she offered to anyone who asked, the willingness to share knowledge that had cost her everything to earn. She's buried beside Torbjörg Vik in the small cemetery behind the church where she was married. The headstone says only her name and dates. The legacy says everything else. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, Halvor Brecka stood in the doorway of a 10 by 12 claim shanty and told a widow with 2 children that the method she had devised was madness. He said the words that any reasonable man would have said, the words that experience demanded. Warm rock if you like, Marit, but when the fire drops, your girls will die before that wall learns pity. The fire dropped. The temperature fell 70 degrees in 8 hours. The storm buried the prairie in white and killed hundreds across 3 territories. But in the morning, in that same shanty, Marit Asen woke to find her children alive. The stove was cold. The air was bitter. Frost covered every surface that was not stone, and beneath her palm, the slate wall was still warm, not hot, not comfortable, but warm, holding the last of what she had given it, giving back what it had learned to keep. The wall had not learned pity. Walls do not learn anything. But Marit had learned what walls could do, and that was enough. A winter dawn, a cold room, a mother's hand on dark river stone, feeling the warmth that had carried her children through the night. Some things do not need to be said. They only need to be felt.